Brut.
Welcome everybody to the 14th edition of The Art of Assembly, and today's edition has the title Audience as Allies, Witnesses and Enemies. And I couldn't think of better participants to this topic than the three that are here, Claire Bishop, Tania Bruguera and Ann Liv Young. So I'm really happy you are here, and literally really happy that you're here, because all the last editions ended up with at least one person missing or the whole thing not happening and so on. So this I was very nervous till a moment ago, and so this is good to start with. And The Art of Assembly is a series of lectures and conversations that began in the beginning of last year on the potential of human gatherings in art, activism and politics. And it's a nomadic series that happened in different cities so far, and often online for known reasons. So, and if you're joining for the first time and you're interested, there's a website with all the lectures online, art-of-assembly.net, and there's also podcasts of all the editions and so on. So I think and we covered quite the terrain of talking about assembly so far, so you might want to have a look. And I, of course, thank very much the Goethe Institute for this opportunity, Jörg Schumacher and the whole team for making this possible, and also the Goethe Program of Performing Architecture run by Susanne Traub, and thanks to Brut Theater in Vienna, who is doing this whole series with me as a home base, so to say, even though we only made it once there because everything else then was online. We have been talking quite a bit about participation in the series, obviously, but mostly we were addressing this term in regard to society and activism and politics. And tonight we will talk about participation with a focus on artistic practices, which again, of course, happens within a very specific context, which are not separated from social and political surroundings. And when we speak about audience participation or activation in Western arts, this has of course been a long tradition in experimental arts, avant-garde, activism art and so on. But in recent years it seems it has become almost a paradigm even in mainstream municipal theaters and so on. So it's something that became very popular, and of course one can ask why is that so and what kind of participation is that actually, and we might do so later on. And of course tonight we are very aware that this conversation is happening in front of the backdrop of Putin's and the Russians' armies' war against Ukraine, and Putin's war against many of his own people, many artists in Russia. So I guess Tania Bruguera's contribution will certainly remind us what it means to demand participation in repressive situations, in situations that actually aim to prevent any participation. And on the other hand, many of us work in political surroundings that seem to non-stop encourage and demand participation, something that Markus Miesen, who was in our last session, called the nightmare of participation. The ongoing compulsion to participate in an all-inclusive capitalism, which, contrary to what Marx predicted so far, has been quite able to resolve its internal conflicts to affirmation. So how to refuse a post-political situation in which participation has become a pure sedative with sinister side effects of shifting responsibility for outcomes onto citizens who are not actually able to have any influence over the events that led to them. The theoretical equivalent to this post-political situation is not seldom so-called participatory theater, in which participation is more often than not just a placebo, in which the decisions it pretends to allow to the audience to make are actually predetermined. So you can maybe go in this direction or in that direction, but both are set up beforehand, compelling the audience to participate in a quite transparent fraud. So the problem is not so much being forced into participation for me, but being forced into a feigned participation. And in this context, we are actually constantly participating, both in society and art, but it is mostly only as consumers of goods and entertainment in a world full of so-called experiences that distract us from demanding actual influence. So it's passivity disguised as activity. But on the other hand, as problematic as the term participation may have become or has been made, I still believe that in arts and in theater, if it wants to be political, it has to confront what it could mean to take part and to get right into the middle of this dilemma. So the question is not just how to avoid faults surface level participation, devoid of meaning. The point is to take back the idea of real participation, to give it meaning again, and to sound out its radical potential. Because I still believe participation in art can serve to examine or develop models of sharing power and responsibility differently, and in this way sound out new forms of participation for a larger social context. And on the other hand, it can also consciously problematize participation, playing with abuse of power, creating a discomfort for audience participants that enables or forces them to reach a different understanding. So this is, of course, quite a tightrope to walk. Art answers the question of responsibility for its participants quite differently than activism or social work would do. Artist and theoretician Pablo Helguera differentiates between non-voluntary participation, involving no negotiation or consent, voluntary participation, involving a transparent agreement, even a contract, and involuntary participation, whose casual, often indirect negotiations are often shaped by hidden intentions in which deceit and deduction play a central role. So I found this differentiation between non-voluntary, voluntary, and involuntary actually quite helpful, because it also shows that it's not so clearly cut what is on which ethical side which one is. So because the voluntary participation, for example, in a Santiago Sierra piece is not necessarily without problems. So that these lines between these trees are also changing, and I think also in the practice of Tania and Ann Liv, this plays a role. So I leave it with these remarks to hand over the microphone to our three guests. We want to look at radical approaches to audiences, turning them from spectators into participants, witnesses, collaborators, or perhaps enemies, or at least adversaries. So first, Claire Bishop will review how the relationship between art and audience has changed in the decade that has passed since her influential book on participation, artificial health, has first been published. Ann Liv Young will talk about her stage personas that are well known for coming too close, physically as well as psychologically, attacking her audience, but at the same time also making herself attackable. And Tania Bruguera will talk about her relationship with audience that she has always challenged to become active participants, not only in her performances, but also in society. So we will start with their inputs. Each one will be about 15 minutes, and then we have a conversation. And first, Claire Bishop will speak. Claire Bishop is a critic and professor at the PhD program in art history at Graduate Center at CUNY here in New York. Her books include, obviously, Artificial Health and Radical Museology from 2013. She's a contributing editor of Art Forum, and her essays and books have been translated into many, many languages. And currently she's completing 2 books, a short publication about Merce Cunningham's event, and a collection of essays about contemporary art and attention. And most recently came out a book of conversations together with Tania, which I read just recently, and it's really a beautiful conversation, I think, between the two of you, and giving an overview over also Tania's work over the years. So I'm very happy you're here, and Claire, it's your turn.
Thank you, Florian, and the Goethe Institute. This is my first public event in 2+ years. I'm so happy. It's so nice to be speaking to a live audience. It's so nice to see friends and students in the audience. And it's also so nice to be part of this really good series that I've been following for a long time. I really recommend the podcast. I feel very honored to be part of this. So, but I've been asked to talk about participation, which I have refused to do for the last 10 years since publishing this book, because you publish a book and people invite you endlessly to talk about the stuff in the book, by which point you have no interest in talking about this at all. But this year I have not been able to avoid it, because it's 10 years. So, okay, this was the book 10 years ago. This is the new book that will be out at the end of this year. Very different cover and aesthetic and message, as you can see. And Verso, the publisher, asked me to write a preface to accompany this, to sort of chart what's gone on since the book was published. And so what you're going to hear today is me testing that out. And it's some of you I've kind of polled for opinions, and I'm very grateful for that, and you'll see some of your thoughts coming in. So some things I would say have not changed. Sorry, do I have to speak? I have to really speak into this now. So some things have not changed. I still think participation is an artistic strategy used in community art, socially engaged art, social practice, performance. It surfaces and declines at different historical moments according to need. It's characterized by a rethinking of the relationship between the artist, the work of art, and the audience. It's often characterized by a prioritization of open-ended process over formal closure and a commitment to social amelioration. And if you, if any of you have ever looked at this book, you will know that I support against that model. I try to sort of advocate or support projects that showed a greater commitment to form and to structure, and that made space not just for togetherness, but also for discomfort. But in other respects, I would say a lot of my approach has taken new directions, largely as a result of relocating from the UK to the US. And so tonight I want to talk about how I understand participation to have changed over the last 10 years, to address two of the book's blind spots, race and technology, and to say a few words about how the book's central aesthetic argument in favor of antagonism has lost force over the last decade. So, do I change pictures yet? No, I'm not. I'm so out of practice with doing this. So the headline, though, is the following provocation. In visual art, at least, participation as a discourse has completely fallen out of the picture. So this might seem a strange claim. From an institutional perspective, participatory art only seems to have gone from strength to strength. You can now get an MFA in social practice, as it's called here, or an MA in socially engaged art, as it tends to be called in Europe, anywhere from Geneva to Portland, Salford to Maine, Bolzano to Arizona, and Queens. I have to plug our local MFA course. Socially engaged artists have won important awards: MacArthur's, Guggenheim's, Artis Mundi, the Velázquez Award, the Turner Prize. Biennials have been restaging historic participatory works and showing archival documentation. Key figures from the history of participatory art have received major museum retrospectives, and their works have entered permanent collections. I think Suzanne Lacey just opened at Queen's Museum last week. Institutions have commissioned high visibility projects from participatory and socially engaged artists, sometimes with blockbuster levels of popularity and accompanying critical ambivalence. And yet, as I want to argue, none of this has been central to debates in contemporary art. Instead, debates of the last decade in the West seem to have fallen into two clear phases. The first was a preoccupation with the post-digital and the non-anthropocentric, roughly 2011 to 2016, which largely sidelined questions of the social in favor of objecthood, matter, and post-human agency. The second, which visibly intensified around 2016, was dominated by questions of identity, especially Black, disabled, indigenous, queer, and trans, assertions of radical subjectivity, often in more traditional media. It's not coincidental that this second phase grew ascendant in tandem with hate crimes, bathroom bills, police brutality, anti-immigrant xenophobia, and the rise of right-wing reactionary politics more generally. As a result, a different set of terms has come to the fore, but I'm going to say more on that in a moment. Now, where participation has flourished over the last decade, I think, is in theatre, performance, and to a lesser extent, dance. In Europe, numerous practitioners have reframed the question of participation in terms of Judith Butler's post-Occupy theory of assembly, and I think Florian's really been key to naming and grouping these tendencies together. So artists experimenting with various forms of gathering, parliaments, and debates. Think of Jonas Stahl, Milo Rau, or Rimini Protocol, tellingly all white men. Education and knowledge exchange has continued to gain momentum, from large-scale events by Hannah Hurzig to small-scale temporary tents in public squares by Ivana Muller, Lotte van der Berg, or Sarah Van Hee, where you actually get the knowledge exchange model converging with this post-Occupy aesthetics of encampment. Other artists have hybridized the participatory and the algorithmic, translating technological platforms into human presence, albeit often to underscore the enduring power of liveness. And then we've also got to a point where the popularity of participation has reached a point where it had to be skewered, a job that fell to performance artists like Ivo Dimchev, whose camp and hilarious P project encouraged and even paid the audience to humiliate themselves on stage, and Michael Portnoy's relational Stalinism, the musical, which underscored the coercive side of participation. Michael, are you laughing at your... So in contemporary dance, The most debated instance of participation over the last decade was Jerome Bell's collaboration with Theatre Horror, a troupe of developmentally disabled actors, and his work with amateur performers of all races and bodily abilities in Gala in 2015. The incursion of performance and contemporary dance into museums, which began to intensify around 2011, traded on the participation adjacent pleasures of immediacy, engagement, and collective presence. It also led to the direct participation of the public, who were either trained up for full-length evening performances, as in the Michael Clarke picture I just showed you, or taught in parallel workshops alongside the performances. And Charmatz is one example, and Teresa de Keersmacher would be another. More often, though, I think participation was consciously ambient, as in Isabel Lewis's Occasions, which managed to synthesize a relationship between dance, social event, and designed environment, harking back to the conviviality of 1990s relational art. Maria Hasabi's decelerated museum choreographies invited the viewers to step over or around the dancers who lay on the floors or staircases of museums. Even more participated by taking photographs and uploading them to Instagram. In dance, too, there was a satire of participation, often by queer artists who exacerbated the phenomena of interpassivity and stage bombing. Think of Ryan McNamara's Meme or Dimchev's Selfie Concert. So why did the discourse of participation fall out of favor? I'd like to propose three main reasons: Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and social media. Now, to set the groundwork for this claim, I need to say a quick word about the context in which my book was conceived and written. Published in June 2012, the manuscript was completed just prior to the massive shift in political consciousness signaled by Occupy in autumn 2011. Occupy marked the new decade as having a qualitatively different political dynamic from the post-Cold War 90s and the post-9/11 2000s, both of which shared a mood of political deadlock that theorists on the left described as post-politics. A fusion of a centrist neoliberalism that enabled a business-friendly center-left and an identity-friendly center-right to compromise in hegemonic immobility. And I think this is nowhere better summed up than in this, cringe-inducing two-channel installation by Francesco Vezzoli called Democracy, which was basically two one-minute, promotional propaganda clips for two US presidential candidates, played by Bernard-Henri Lévy and Sharon Stone, shown running against each other and having identical agendas and policies. So what I'm painting for you is the kind of the picture of the 2000s in which I was writing this book, in which the work that was being made at that time across Europe, I don't know what's happening with this, going too fast. Across Europe and the US, artists were lamenting the loss of collectivity and asserted the need to come together. Another important strand of work depicted, staged, or reenacted protest. Now, both tendencies had a subdued mood of resignation, even paralysis, and participation in these works seemed to become a substitute for politics. Artificial hells took shape against this foreclosure of conflict, the suffocatingly smooth operations of third-way centrism, to which it responded by appealing for disruption and friction. Occupy, however, heralded a conspicuous shift towards dissent and mobilization, a shift from the artistic representation of resistance to its actualization. The makeshift encampment and signage at Zuccotti Park even looked like a work by Thomas Hirschhorn. By 2016, art historian and activist Yates McKee could argue that Occupy had, quote, signaled the end of socially engaged art, unquote, which had now matured into real-world movement building. On both left and right, the decade was characterized by the imperative to show up, be present, and protest, from Tahrir Square to Occupy to Gezi Park to Euromaidan to Black Lives Matter to the Women's March to the Umbrella Movement to the Gilets jaunes, and arguably even Trump's minions storming the Capitol last January. Gently ameliorative microtopias flew out the window, embodied protest became mainstream, often with a very photogenic visual identity. Throughout the 2010s, a constant and prolific thread of art activism took place outside the purview of the art market. The most high-profile examples pointed inward to the museum, with calls for divestment, decolonization, boycott, and unionization. Participatory strategies were deployed by some of these groups, such as Not Alternatives Indigenous Pedagogies at the Natural History Museum, or die-ins by Pain and Extinction Rebellion. But participation was now one tactic among many, rather than a formal end in itself. Another difference is that artists were working more in collaboration with an existing ecology of organizations, such as groups campaigning to end corporate investment in for-profit prisons or environmental destruction. Think here of Caicedo's work with anti-dam campaigners in the Amazon rainforest, or maybe Canepa Hanscoluga's work with the water protectors at Standing Rock. And I think the targeted nature of these campaigns differ from a lot of social practice projects of the 90s and 2000s that worked with gentler, uncontroversial notions of education, urban regeneration, and civic participation. Now, from 2013 onwards, the rise of Black Lives Matter unleashed a different vocabulary for social engagement and conspicuously avoided the word participation. Take, for example, the most powerful form of collective creativity in 2020, which was the resemiotization of monumental statuary through graffiti, projections, and social activation, best seen at the statue of Robert Lee in Richmond, Virginia. Now, you could say that participation was all over this monument and its environment, but the term was never invoked. Instead, the rhetoric was one of reclaiming space, collective knowledge, and communal healing. The word that signaled or epitomized this new attitude was care. Take, for example, Simone Lee's Free People's Medical Clinic and the Waiting Room. Both fall squarely in the lineage of social practice, but center a Black feminist discourse of care. Located in the Stuyvesant Mansion in Brooklyn, the Free People's Medical Clinic referred back to 19th century Black women medical pioneers and nurses who'd lived in that part of Brooklyn and offered classes on Afro-centering Pilates, well-woman care, and community acupuncture, among many others. The project's nap ministry and Black power naps continue this call, asserting the right of Black folks to refuse the grind of capitalism and practice self-care, even presenting rest as reparations. Indigenous performance has taken up a related rhetoric of care, but with more emphasis on healing and guardianship of the environment. The increased presence of ritual in performances over the last decade implicitly rejects Western epistemologies of political action as presentist and secular, since it by definition appeals to the sacred and thus to forces beyond the present, ideas like land, spirit, or transgenerational knowledge. Such practices have honored ancestors, victims of racist violence, and reaffirmed contact with the land. The non-binary First Nations artist S.J. Norman, for example, created a durational ceremony in which participants each had to pledge a drop of blood or receive a nail tattoo, while the artist's back was incised with 147 cuts, each representing the death of a Black person in police custody. So in their specificity and of their themes and audiences, the above examples contrast with the contemporary artists discussed in Artificial Hells, who frequently position themselves as repairing the social bond, largely in relationship to a public that was defined site-specifically, right, in relationship to a particular geographical area, and often within that as working class or immigrant. The artist thus assumed the role of benefactor to a disenfranchised other, or in the model I counter-proposed, flaunted that disparity as part of the work. By contrast, I think Black and Indigenous artists have addressed work to their own communities or sustain a balance between privacy and publicity. Lee, for example, refers to her work as autoethnographic and conceives it explicitly for Black women, keeping photo documentation to a minimum. And I think this differentiates contemporary art and performance here from trends within contemporary theatre and dance and performance in Europe, and especially the UK, which I would see as exemplified by this recent publication, Performing Care, from 2020, which details projects in the UK and Europe, almost all of which foreground white artists, but working with immigrants, asylum seekers, foster children, and the disabled. Right, so the rhetoric of care is in both places, but it has a slightly different valence in both locations. So in the US, by contrast, one effect of the turn to care is to expose the whiteness of participation as a discourse, a whiteness that my book completely reinforced. The book features Latin American artists, but they're almost exclusively Euro-descendant, and only one Asian American artist. And the reason for this, I think, is in part because I was so adamant that I didn't want to deal with North American art in the book. Because to me, the discourses of public art and site specificity and art activism were already really dominated by North American academics, and I wanted to turn my gaze away and deal with Europe and the legacy of the historic avant-garde. But of course, I ended up centering white European artists and their legacy rather than pushing to uncover other genealogies. And I can imagine a revision of the book, which I'm not going to do, but I'm just going to throw a hypothetical new chapter out there for you, which would include a chapter on this sort of this as yet unwritten history of black social practice in the 2010s. And I think this is a trajectory that, as you can tell from what I've been saying, is in which participation is inextricable from a discourse of regeneration, resistance, and support that I think goes back to the Black Panther Party's modeling of new forms of health and education activism from 1968 onwards, and which have been, in turn, an explicit point of reference for Simone Lee. So actually, let's just pause and have a water. So if race was a blind spot in artificial health, then so too was technology. My definition of participatory art was unquestioningly in person, a group of people doing things together in a shared place and time. The construction of meaning had to be embodied and located, a visible assembly rather than a dispersed community of anyone, anywhere online. The decision to exclude digital participation from my purview again seemed very logical at the time. I needed to keep the scope manageable, I had no interest in digital aesthetics whatsoever, and I wanted to sustain a visual connection between contemporary participation and its historical forebears. As a result, I drew a cordon sanitaire between the interactive, into which I lumped everything technological, and the participatory, which centered presence and thus aligned art with theater. In retrospect, of course, this decision ignored the rich interplay between digital and live, virtual and in real life, public and private, which could already be seen in experimental theater as well as in art activism, and which has only intensified through the vicissitudes of the pandemic. Web 2.0 is, of course, a watershed in the history of participation and was completely inadequately confronted in my book. Written only a handful of years, so the book was, again, 2012, written only a handful of years into the rise of Twitter and Facebook from 2006, the iPhone, 2007, and Instagram, 2010. The book failed to develop any relationship between participation and social media. The only place I go near it is in the conclusion, when I dismiss Anthony Gormley's mediagenic project One Another as Twitter art, and I'm quoting someone in The Guardian there. As it turned out, this kind of amateur free-for-all became much less visible in the 2010s, precisely because social media platforms like TikTok came to offer more effective sites for self-expression than artist-organized events, right? So maybe that Gormley piece is really the peak of something that was never actually fulfilled because social media came to displace it. So such social media platforms have managed to remove the problematic status of the artist as a well-meaning intermediary, while also generating a repertoire of images that feel more authentic because self-generated. The ubiquity of social media, its efficacy in terms of reaching huge audiences, and the hits of dopamine it gratifyingly drip feeds, I think have all been central to the demise of in-person participation over the last decade. Now, the prevalence of social media has also impacted upon research and montage-based art practices that incorporate vernacular and everyday material. Procedures that in previous decades might well have been foregrounded as a participatory process. Forensic architecture, for example, regularly draws upon open source and citizen journalism as part of its research process, but this fact is so internalized now that it barely registers in the group's self-description of its projects. Other artists, like Martine Sims and Arthur Jafer, scour the internet for footage and integrate it into their videos. This is never framed as participation because their sources are not the result of targeted open calls, but are already out there. Participants no longer need to be interpolated, and the artist no longer needs to generate his own footage, as was the case, for example, with Phil Collins or Artur Ziemiewski in the 2000s. Today, the art lies in aggregating pre-existing sources. At least in theory, participation and social media share an embrace of leveled hierarchies and decentralization. In reality, as we know, these platforms are run by transnational corporations in the service of surveillance capitalism. While the same urge for community, communication, and feedback mobilizes social practice and Facebook, they differ greatly in their scale and ambition. Insistently local rather than global domination, and relationships consolidated in person rather than virtually. The pandemic has, of course, completely changed the idea of collective gathering as something possible online, just as recent efforts to use blockchain technology and NFTs have created an entirely online art. Participatory NFTs exist. Adidas and Prada just launched one with the artist Zach Lieberman, but it's unclear to me how this is anything other than digital marketing and a return to reactionary notions of originality and authorship as the ultimate criterion of economic value. Now, Well, one final note about the kind of nail in the coffin of participation, and I think that's museums. And I think they've aided this demise precisely through their use of digital technology. Many a dull article has enumerated the uses of Web 2.0 for museum education, itemizing trends like participatory tagging or using QR codes to access accompanying audio. Over the last decade, these efforts have been subsumed by a discourse of viewer engagement. Sprinkled liberally across institutional mission statements, engagement conveys the idea that access to and participation in culture is an unquestioned democratic, even universal good. Technology plays a key role in engagement, from museum apps to social media accounts to online collections and the creation of immersive sensory experiences. And Bloomberg Connects at Tate is really prime suspect here. Yet I think our engagement is an ideological reframing of participation, away from collective cultural production and towards marketing and audience development. It's also paternalistic and monodirectional, a matter of audiences dutifully consuming content rather than challenging any of the ideas on display. Engagement, we might say, is where participation goes to die, or at least perhaps where my original distinction between participation and interactivity can be reinstated. So if an aesthetic of engagement veers towards the populist, the photogenic, and the technophilic, quickly consumed, then an aesthetic of care is often associated with slowness, duration, and a human touch, taking time to nurture, to look after, to take notice, to be alongside rather than to look at, to attend and to reclaim. Care then opposes harm. It also opposes antagonism, and in this it finds an unexpected bedfellow with engagement. Now, artificial hells was underpinned by a Lacanian-influenced political philosophy, Laclauenmove's theory of radical democracy as antagonism. But this translates uneasily into ethics and aesthetics. I subscribed to a Lacanian ethical model of the artist that allowed me to think art in terms of individual psychic necessity, a vision stemming from desire rather than from a guilty sense of obligation to society. I set the freedom of the id against the guilty conscience of the superego. And this model of the artist, however, I now look back on and I'm really not so sure about. It dovetails so uncomfortably with the libertarian individualism that has come to the fore in alt-right culture and aesthetics. It slips easily into a self-centered narcissism that deploys post-truth, transgression, and appropriation. The model of artistic subjectivity proposed in Artificial Hells and the freedom at all costs attitude of contemporary libertarians are a little too close for comfort, even though their themes, methods, and politics differ greatly. Both deploy and enjoy disruption. So the drama played out in the final pages of my book between the artistic and social critiques of capitalism has only been intensified by the alt-right co-option of transgression, complicating the legacy of the historical avant-garde and the counterculture. Now, the resultant atmospheres of nihilism and conflict are not just stoked, of course, by online trolls from below, but orchestrated by those in power. The last decade has seen, of course, the global rise of right-wing nationalism and repressive authoritarianism, and led to the manipulation of social media to manufacture social discord, a polarization that political theorist Jodie Dean has compared to civil war. And I think this has created a completely different context for participation in both art and activism from the neoliberal cultural policies of Northern Europe that were the point of departure for my book. A decade ago, it seemed unthinkable that antagonism and disruption would become the political norm. Today, millions are living under authoritarian artificial hells. In retrospect, my book seems cosseted by a privileged Northern European worldview of the 2000s. I berated the state's instrumentalization of culture and creativity to create a positive image of social unity, yearning instead for art's freedom. Yet what followed, in many places, was so much worse. The right-wing instrumentalization of social media to sow division and distrust. Outrage, hatred, and suspicion became the affects of daily life, prompting new genres of political fatigue and disillusionment. Hence, the appeal of a retreat to care and self-care. So just as the terms participation and social engagement became ways of writing the individualism and privatization of the neoliberal 90s, so I think care has become a response to the nationalist, white supremacist 2010s. The difference between the two terms, participation and care, is predominantly a matter of racial and temporal inflection. Care seeks to repair a damage that is historical and ongoing. Unlike the presentism of most social practice, there's a noticeable invocation of history in some of these projects. Yet the politics of care, like that of participatory art, tend to be defined via negativa, in opposition to what is dominant. In this case, individualism, objectification, and harm. Perhaps then there isn't so much difference between participation and care, and in the end we've witnessed not so much the demise of participation as a discourse, but its transformation, the latest one of so many over its long history, to suit the needs of today's political climate. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot for this breathtaking run through the last 10 years. So we will come back to some of this, but before we continue with Ann Liv Young. So we go now into, after kind of an overview of many things, we go into two artistic practices. And oops, what is happening here? Ann Liv Young is a choreographer and performer who has been touring Europe and the US for the last 20 years, and her work is oftentimes titled provocative, but if you look closer, you can see that it's also specific, or it's also touching upon something that you might not really feel well as an audience yourself already. As I said, it's like becoming physical and psychologically challenging often, but also there's a transformation. We briefly talked before about it in the work in recent years, which will be interesting to look at. Her works include Antigone from 2018, Electra from 2014, Sleeping Beauty, from 2013, and Sherry's Room from 2011, and Sherry is one of the characters that continues till today, or at least till 2 years ago, and many others, and her work has been presented at major venues and festivals in New York and in Europe. I'm really happy you're here.
Oh my gosh, so strange. Okay, so I guess what I'm going to do is just talk to you a little bit about like my relationship to the audience. Seems like a good place to start. I don't know any of you, so maybe we'll start with Sherry. So basically, Sherry is a character that I made when I was actually pregnant with Lovey, who is here right now. And I made her because I had been touring a show called Snow White. And I was in Amsterdam and they had lost my set. And I had, very bad morning sickness. And I think that I was very stressed about having a baby and making things that were, in general, making people pretty frustrated. Writing things like I wasn't going to be a good mother and, stuff like that. And so I was like, okay, I should make a character who actually directly engages with the audience and who can, take a piece of writing out of a writer's hand and read it and tear it up or catch it on fire and, look at them in the eyes and say, excuse me, why did you write this? Very directly. And Sherry is she's on the right with the blonde hair. Sherry is based on my mom and my dad, who are both from North Carolina. They're both Southern. And she's sort of a conglomeration of both of them. So that's kind of where Sherry came from. And then I think as I was performing her, in many different places, she sort of morphed into, it was like people hated Sherry and people loved Sherry, but mostly people hated her because I think they were like, it's too much. You're asking about my sex life and a live audience, or you're asking about if I've had an abortion, and it's not these aren't questions to be provocative. These were like Sherry was really expecting an answer, a true answer, and could somehow tell if your answer wasn't true. Truly, I think she really can do that. So then I was like, I think maybe if I became a therapist as this character, people would like me more and would trust me more, because then I'm literally trying to help people. And I have a background in going to therapy. I started going to Al-Anon when I was 4. I would go like 2 hours away from my home to Al-Anon. And so I think there was a lot of time where I was like, this is how I'm feeling, these are my problems. I felt very comfortable doing that. So it felt like a very natural progression to me to make Sherry a sherapist. So then Sherry started doing therapy. And like, I think she's really good at it. She really helped a lot of people. Truly, she really did. I did like a big show at the, oh my gosh, what the heck is it called? In Spain. The psychological, what is it called? Psychiatric convention. And I like gave therapy to like hundreds of psychiatrists. Truly, this is not even a joke. And many of them were from all over the world. There was one guy from Lebanon who was very offended by my strategies. And that was super interesting because he was engaged, he was with Sherry, and we did a therapy session in front of the audience, and my main message was like, I try to get a lot of information from you very, very quickly by reading your body language, by asking you very direct questions, really, really honest questions, like I want to know the answer. This is not really just for like performative reasons. It's a true dialogue and a true relationship. And that was a really amazing experience. And then Sherry, oh my gosh, what happened to her after that? Then basically the last thing I did as Sherry was like a terrible disaster. In Berlin, I did a show called The Good Sherry. And it's like, if you're a good audience member, you get pulled in closer to Sherry. Like there's like a circle and you're sitting on the very outside. And if you're a really good audience member, you get pulled closer and closer to her. And it ended, it was a great show, but it ended very stressfully with, long story short, people got very offended because I rapped a Cardi B song and I said the N-word. I rapped the N-word in the song as Sherry. I sang the lyrics to the song. And there were 2 people there that got super offended, and like they cut my show, they cut my sound, and everyone like sat around this man who was very hurt. It's like much more complicated than I'm making it, but essentially this is what happened. So then I kind of took a break from Sherry, not because like I don't believe in her or believe in that show. I think it was a great show. And so that's Sherry, and I'm still doing therapy sessions, especially during the pandemic because people need help. But I've kind of taken a break from her. But that's sort of, I think, why I started doing such intense work with the audience, like really going close to them physically and mentally. And then I also have a show. This is actually Sherry. This is actually current Sherry. So I'm now selling like vintage Coach bags as Sherry. And it's kind of, this is actually a photo of a computer screen, which I appreciate. But basically, I'm finding like Coach bags from various places, and I'm selling them on the internet, but using this character to sell them. And she sells a lot of them. So that is good. Just to let you know what is happening. So this is another show I have called The Mermaid Show. And this show came, I think, after Sherry, where I play a mermaid. It's like loosely based on The Little Mermaid, whatever that means. And I'm a mermaid, and there's many different versions of the show, but basically I start relatively docile, and then as soon as the audience feels very comfortable, I sort of attack, and I go after the audience. And my motive and my goal with this show was really to really terrify people, so much that I wanted them to run out of the theater. That was really my goal, and in many of the shows it's happened, and it's been, like when you go to a haunted house and you're just terrified, where you're just like, I have to leave, this is like too much for me. I really wanted people to be truly horrified. So I spent a lot of time and money getting a really good, believable costume. The tail was handmade by one of the people that helped with like the original Splash tail from the Splash movie, which was kind of exciting. I think he's actually called the Mer Tailor is his name. And so I had this tail made, and then not in this photograph, but in the actual show, I use a lot of latex, so I have like webbed hands and like, webbed face, and I have contacts in, and I look pretty scary. And then there's a section where I try to sort of lure you. I choose somebody from the audience, and I really try to like lure you into me. Like really try to find a connection with you, like a true connection. And I move from person to person until I really feel like it's, a real connection. And then that's the person where my helper hands me my raw Spanish mackerel, and I like start just like ripping open the fish, basically on top of you. And which to me is like, sounds really exciting and fun if I were to attend that show. Truthfully, like that's like, okay, interactive theater, that's like, sounds exciting to me. But it made a lot of people very angry, especially men. Got super mad, and I was attacked with a microphone stand when I was pregnant. Completely crazy. The guy had to be like escorted out of the theater. And this was a theater where people were drinking, so maybe that had something to do with it. A lot of men, for some reason, got super angry with this show, and I find that really fascinating. So basically I do this, I rip open the fish, and I really chase people, and they think, well, she can't get up the risers because she has like this like very heavy tail, but and I can't when I'm rehearsing, like I can't do anything, but for some reason in the show, I can just move like lightning, and I move so fast, and I like jump up the stairs, and I'm like in the very top of the thing, and people are so scared, and there's like nothing left to the fish except bones at the end, and there's like guts getting in people's hair and purses, and it's a magical show. And then I was supposed to do it in Copenhagen, but then it got canceled because of COVID, because, it's important that we're like close and there's, bodily fluids flying around. So that's Mermaid Show, which, back. This is an image from Antigone, a show that I made, like it was the last big show I made. It was not very successful. And I made it when I was on like antidepressants because I have like very bad vestibular migraine, and so I was on this medication for it, and I was going through like a pretty horrible breakup. So I made this show, and I think it really feels like I was on antidepressants when you watch the show. It feels like you can't really tell, like, is it good, is it bad, is it a show, isn't it a show? However, the cast is amazing, and we changed it for every single venue. The most recent performance we did was in my apartment in Bushwick, where we emptied my entire apartment. It's like a tenement apartment. It's like 900 square feet, and it's a rent-stabilized apartment. And we emptied the entire thing, and we made it look exactly how it looked in the theater. So we covered all the walls in cardboard. Everything was covered in cardboard, so it looked like we were in a cardboard box. And then we did the show. I think we did like 5 nights of it in the apartment. And the show, Antigone, really centers around Antigone and the relationship to her boyfriend. And so I tried to make it like, modern. So there was like a lot of domestic violence and a lot of fight scenes. And this image is actually from, I think, when we were in Zurich doing the show, and we had like, we had just like people that were like kind of sculptures on stage, and they were being live painted on stage. And this is a person that I went to elementary school with. And it was like random that she got in touch with me and was like, I'm coming to your show. And I was like, do you want to be in it? And so I think that's another really important part of what I make, is this relationship to the audience, but also to the people that are in the show. It's like, what is their relationship to the show? Like, I think anyway, my relationship with her is a whole other session. But anyway, so I made t-shirts with this similar image on it, and they've been selling like hotcakes. Mostly thankful to Lovey, my 14-year-old, who sells them at her high school out of her locker, which is incredible. So that's Antigone, and yeah, I mean, that's really the most exciting part of that, was being in my apartment. It's so small. People were sitting on my kid's bunk bed and really all around us and in the hallway and in the stairwell, and it was an amazing way to take a show that's like touring larger theaters in Europe and really make it feel like you can like reclaim it and do it how you want to do it, and you don't have to rent a space or anything like that. So this is actually a new character that I've made that I'm really trying to make more video stuff, because my boyfriend is a filmmaker and I'm trying to utilize his expertise. And my relationship, I think, to performance has really changed a lot since the pandemic, like I'm sure everybody's here has. I feel like I'm like becoming really anti-performance. Like I feel so nervous today. I feel like I have a lot of anxiety about being in front of people. I don't know what is happening to me. I'm having like a mental breakdown, but so I'm sort of trying to understand what this is and like why it's happening. And maybe it's because I made such intense stuff for so long that I'm having like, it's like payback, you know? Like I'm like getting what I deserve finally. So this is a new character. She doesn't really have a name, but I'm making like video stuff with her basically. And yeah. This is also Sherry, and I'm making another project that is supposed to premiere in Israel in a year, where Sherry is narrating Anne Frank, the show of Anne Frank. So I play Sherry, obviously, and I also play Anne Frank. And it's like a 2-woman show or a 1-woman show. And this is a photo from me being Sherry narrating the Anne Frank story. And again, this is going to be a live performance, but also it's going to be a video as well. And I'm not sure if they go together or not. But again, it's kind of trying to figure out like what is my relationship to the audience right now, and I sort of want to change it, but also continue playing with like the same kind of themes if I have the stomach to do that. This is me actually as Anne Frank. I don't know why my eyes look like that, but it was taken like down a stairwell. So that's me playing Anne Frank. This was actually some of the like promotional stuff for Antigone in my apartment. It was like I was guarding the entrance. That makes sense, right? It's like welcoming you and also guarding. So it was just like promotion for the Antigone show in my house. And this is my newest project, and she's called Donna Detective. And she is actually a detective. So I dress as this woman, and I'm like really, I live in upstate New York as well as in the city, and I'm trying to solve mysteries around Hancock, New York, which is where I live part of the time. And there are a lot of weird things that happen in that town, like people go missing and, you know, money gets stolen. The Chinese restaurant got broken into and a lot of money got stolen. So I literally am taking on what's that called? The mystery. I'm taking on the mystery, the crime, and I'm trying to solve it. I have a pit bull who like comes with me everywhere just to make it look like more legitimate. And that's, I don't know, this has been super fun to work on. We're also making a live, like an animation of it. So it's like, I'm this character, but then I have a doll that looks just like this character, and we like do stuff with her. You know, she does the same stuff I do. That's not so complicated to understand. So I guess in terms of audience and my relationship, I feel like I'm really pulling away from the audience and less interested in people, you know, and maybe more interested in like these weird people that live in the middle of nowhere and have all these mysterious crimes that are happening to them. I guess I'm starting to feel maybe it's like another form of therapy or sherapy, like I can actually help them in some way. Because I think when you do these live shows in European theaters, mostly, you know, mostly privileged people, I don't know, you get to a point where you're just like, am I really helping people? I do think I was actually helping people, just as a side note. But I'm like, I don't know, is it enough? Is it fulfilling enough? It's like, a woman will be like, fuck you, like, you're so rude. You know, why do you have to talk to people like this? I don't need to answer these questions. And then I'll say, you know, I'm sorry, I was paid to do this. This is my job. I care about you. You may not care about me. And then they'll be like, the only nice thing about you are your legs and your boobs. And then it's like this, like, you know what I mean? And it's intense. And I think it gets to a place that's pretty fascinating, because then it's like the person has to either choose to stay in the theater or leave, because it can escalate to that point. And that's a super nice thing, because they actually have to make a choice. Are they gonna stay or are they gonna leave? And then they have to think about, well, why would I stay and why would I leave? But I think doing stuff like that for so long is like super exhausting. And so now I'm focused on this character. Sherry's brought me to Donna. That's it, thank you.
Thanks a lot. And yes, of course, it's true that looking after 2 years of not really meeting people, looking back of some of your performances and being in some of these your performances looks very distant from today. So, I think another thing will be the question of the frame in which it happens. The idea of roles and intimacy of care and confrontation is something we will for sure talk about, but now I'm really happy also that Tania Bruguera is here. Tania is a Cuban artist and activist whose work often considers totalitarianism, immigration, and human rights. Her work has been represented in leading collections of MoMA and Tate Modern, amongst other places. And in 2015, she founded the Institute of Artivism, Instituto de Artivismo Hannah Arendt, INSTA, in order to, quote, foster civic literacy and policy change. And in 2021, she agreed to leave Cuba to assume the position of senior lecturer in media and performance at Harvard University in exchange for the release of 25 political prisoners. I'm really happy you're here, and the floor is yours.
Hi, how you doing? Okay. So, well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to see people who are my friends for a long time here. So basically, I'm not sure I care about talking about art anymore. I'm just doing that because I love you, Claire, and I'm glad that they invited me. But after everything that has happened in Cuba, where at this moment we have thousands of prisoners, political prisoners, who are people from which more than 100 are underage kids, and people who, we have actually some underage kids who are 17, 18, 19-year-old, 15, 16, 17, and 18-year-old, who have been sentenced to more years in prison than the years they have lived. We have the case of one kid that is 17-year-old that has been condemned to 23 years in prison. So I am in a situation of very different from 3 years ago, not because of the pandemic, but because I spent all the time of the pandemic by chance. I went back to Cuba, and then we were creating what has become a very important movement of artists, activists, and civic society to actually be against the regime that we have today, that is not only totalitarian, but is stupid, absurd, and inefficient. So I have thought the last 2 years a lot about what art is, what I should do art, and of course, when you have hundreds of interrogation sessions where the first thing the interrogator tells you is you are not an artist, at some point you are like, yeah, I don't want to be an artist. So that's cool. Why is it the problem for you? So it's interesting that when I'm outside of Cuba, I try not to be an artist and to do artwork that doesn't look like art. And if people go to my projects and say, why is this art? I'm a very happy artist. But in Cuba, I have to do the opposite. I have to become, the idea of art they have is extremely conventional and reactionary, so, I mean the government. So basically, it's interesting that while I don't want to be an artist outside of Cuba, I have to claim my being an artist in Cuba because it's a protection for me, although not anymore because the new laws in Cuba who are following the Russians' law, these are the new owners of Cuba, the Russians, And they have been giving a lot of power to a government, so you cannot even, like now, it's not like before where you were doing a project and you were censored. Now they censor before you do the project because they imagine that you're going to do something. So it's preventive law that they are enabling there. But yeah, so this is an interesting situation. But nevertheless, I'm here. You don't want to hear me complaining about Cuba, so I'm going to talk about some more projects I've done to please some people. And but really, I think after everything that we have gone through, not only in Cuba but in the world, we should start cutting the bullshit, basically, and start doing things that really are meaningful, and also that are not games that we artists create to please institutions or to please ourselves, but things that really matter to others. So, well, my propaganda section has ended, so I'm going to talk about my projects. One of the things that I have been dealing with for a long, long time is understanding that art generates energy. That when you are in front of an artwork, and I tell you why I discovered this, because sometimes it can be a painting, it can be a sculpture, it can be something I have no relationship or like to do myself, but sometimes I go to exhibitions, so I go to see artists' work, and then I have this urge to leave the place and go back home and work. You know, I don't want to see anyone, I don't want to talk to my friends. I'm seeing a project and I'm like, oh my God, that energy is telling me to do something else. So having that been something that happened to me a lot, when I find something that moved me, then I was thinking more and more, what is the energy the work is sharing? And what do we do with the energy of the work? And what I feel mostly is that a lot of people, and the audience in general, are wasting that energy. Because what we do with that energy is just, we feel it, we are in front of the work, we feel it, and then we go home, or we go to have a drink, and then we don't do anything with it. So what I want to do with my work is to work with that energy. You know, try to situate that energy and bring people into that moment where they feel they have to do something with it. So it's not always successful, but I'm trying. And the other thing is that, why do I think it's important to do something with that energy? Because for me, my work is not what you see, it's not what you perform in the space, but it's what you do after with that. So I'm going to show you a few examples. I didn't put anything about what happened in Cuba because I don't, even if I was a very, very, very active member of all these movements that we created, 27N, MCA, and other movements, I don't feel I have the right to show that to you as an artist because it's a collective project, so yeah. So basically, another aspect of my work, another axis of my work is the idea of trying to transform affect into political effectiveness. And what I mean by that is, like, I cannot stand to do art that is complaining or is only showing what is happening, because we have so many other ways to show things. I would like to do art that transform the anger, transform the pain into something else, into political agency. So this is what I have been trying to do all my life with the work. And look, I'm not saying efficient. I'm not talking about efficiency, but effectiveness. So this is a big difference there. So, of course, one thing that has happened in the course of my projects is that I don't always create work for the same audience. Like, I distinguish audiences. So basically, every time I perform for a certain type of audience, what I'm really doing is presenting the role, one possible role for artists. And this is something I've also been interested in. And they change. For example, this is an example of a piece I did in many long time ago, 98. But the audience for that piece was actually the people in the streets, the people who understood the wink that I was doing to them, how I was talking symbolically about the oppression, about the promises that were not fulfilled. So for them, I was the artist as being part of their subconscious, of being the person who say what they don't want to say or they're afraid to say. Then I have also done this kind of work, this is very old, 93, in which my audience is actually the rethinking of our history. So for me, the audience here is not the people reading the newspaper that I created with all the information of the moment, it's actually revisiting our history. And I do this in a lot of my work as well. And this is another role, is the role of the artist as the more classical one, And of course, there is another audience for which I have created performances, and this is the institutional audience. So sometimes my audience is not the people who are part of it, but the institution that have invited me to do the project, or the institution that are in charge of the problem that we are addressing. So in this case, this is something that is also, and sometimes they are as far away from art as this one, where I participated in 2013 with a group of experts at the United Nations to create the first report on freedom of expression and cultural rights. So I was performing as well, and this was the audience that was my goal. So this is another area I work with, which is what I call self-critical, self-critique, institutional self-critique, which I try to put the institutions in front of their, what they do. So I'm going to bring some examples. They're all, this one I bring it because Claire is here. So, so basically, as this is a project in which something very strange happened because I wanted people to react, but I understood, and many people did not react. So people were just following as there was. But then in this piece, I understood that sometimes to create a reaction in the performances, you need to generate the proper conditions for the work to happen. So for example, in this piece, the Tate owns it, but they cannot stage it anytime they want. They can only stage the piece when there is some big event in the world, like maybe now Ukraine or something where people are already aware of the vulnerability they have and the lack of agency they have. So this is another, yeah. And of course, for me, in this case, it was very important that the audience was not informed that this is an artwork, so we didn't put the name or the title. Nobody knew I was part of the show. So the idea of not knowing is art, again, was very important as a way to generate a situation in which people thought it was reality. And this is what I call hyper-reality, and I use that a lot in my work, which people have the distance, the distance of knowing it is not real, but feeling it as real as possible. So this is a piece I did in 2005 in Moscow, and this is a piece that is quite complex because there are 3 levels of agency and of audiences. One, well, the idea of the piece is called Trust Workshop, and I wanted to find ex-KGB agents who were inactive during the Soviet times, and to do trust workshop, like using all the knowledge they have to damage people's life and to screw them, actually to restore, to do some sort of restorative justice and bring trust to people who have lost trust in the government, institution, and so on. Second level of audience was the people who did not have access to the piece because they can only look at the work through peephole, you say, of the. And then you have the people who actually enter and had access to the whole spectacle, which was these monkeys and eagles. And actually, what I perform here is what politicians do, which is generated generating a spectacle so people don't see what they should see. And in this case, what they should have seen is the portrait of the guy in the back. Well, of course, they take their photo, they're very happy, and then they forgot to see the guy in the back who is the creator of the KGB. And this, of course, was done when Putin raised to power, and it is what I call political timing specific work. What happened in this work is it was a lot of contradiction because the ethics came in. Like, are we going to show what the KGB guy is doing to the Russians? Are we going to translate for the international audience? Who has the right to participate in this project? And I think that's something that I was really keen to work with. And I decided at the end not to show the work, but only show the manifestation of the work, the conclusions of the work, so which is this. Some people really like it. So basically, I have done other projects which are more about creating institutions or para-institutions. And I want to talk about a project I did in Mexico, in the Sala Siqueiros. Basically, this is a different way to engage with the audience, because instead of creating, and this is 2005, nothing has happened, like Occupy, nothing happened. So at this time it was quite harsh, I think, to have more. I mean, it's not that easy now, everybody do protests all the time, but at that time it was a little harder. So what we decided is to hire 100 voceros, and the voceros are the people who shout the news in Mexico City from the newspaper, so people buy them. And what we did with them is we gave them a list of rights for immigrants that we wanted to be considered by the candidates of the presidency, and we did this during the elections in Mexico. And in Mexico it was very interesting because they were talking always about immigration, but talking about the Mexicans in the US who bring money or who are part of the, but they never talk about the immigrants they had in Mexico, coming from, South America and other countries, and who were actually treated the same way the Mexicans are treated here. So I think I wanted to bring that to them. And one thing that happened that is really great, I didn't put the video today, is for the first time, a candidate, a presidential candidate, talked about this. And he actually, we had our list that we submitted to all the candidates, and actually he kind of went through almost all of the points that we wanted. So that was quite fun and unexpected. So yes, in this case, this is a forced audience, because the people who were performing were at the audience of the performance as well. And this is done in Zócalo, so. But I decided that this kind of work should not live only in the memory or be just an event. So I wanted actually to register the project. And in Mexico, every 6 years, they open for potential new parties. So actually here we were, I don't see us, well, the slide is too big. But actually we were number 45. So we inscribed, I don't see it because it's too big. But we were the number 45. So we actually, the way to see that piece and the audience of that piece will be actually the people who see the documents that register the new parties. And I did another project that is also talking about institutions, and this one is a project when the Pope Francis got elected, and I decided to bring back the political side of the church. So this is a postcard, front, back, and basically what we were doing was collecting signatures to send the Pope, asking him that he could give Vatican City citizenship to immigrants in the world who had no papers. And we were claiming, because the Catholic Church is so good, that we were claiming they should do it to anyone, no matter what religion they were professing. We have by now, we had 30,000 or so, but of course the church only pay attention to millions and beyond. So yeah, So it's something. It was very interesting because people were quite pissed off about the work because they were saying that the church is not political and that the Pope did not want to be into politics and so on. So basically, yeah, so this was also, and also part of what I do with the audience is take this as educational moments. It was interesting too because there were people from Israel were asking, but who exactly are we asking for? Like they wanted to see if Palestinians were part of it, so they signed or not. But, and it was interesting because how much what was happening in the news, we did that over, I think, 2 months. So everything that happened in the news were affecting the reaction of the people regarding the right of immigrants or not to have papers. I remember there was a time where a lot of kids were crossing the border, and there was a big display on the news, so people were like, yes, yes, we do. They didn't read what we said, you know, they just signed right away, thinking about the kids and so on. So basically, this is a piece I did in Cuba, and the other thing that I feel is important is I don't want everybody to participate. I don't care that everybody participate, and actually sometimes I make sure that some people are unable to react. And sometimes those are, for example, in Cuba, the Cuban government. I remember a piece I did where I put people in front of the microphone, and there was an image of Fidel with the dove, and I reproduced that, but then I put 2 people dressed in uniform, in the actual uniforms of the army. So I created an image that could not be disrupted by people in power, because then it looked like they themselves were against their government or the army. So I think it's important also to select who we want to react. We don't want this kind of massive generic reaction, but understand why and for what and whom we want to react. So in this case, of course, I did this piece when Obama and Raul, again, political timing is specific, something that Claire has written a lot about, too, and I wanted to see if they would bring also freedom. And then something happened. Sometimes my performances are for one person, and that person is called Kenya, and is my interrogator. And I had more than 200 interrogation sessions with her, and sometimes I am performing during the interrogation sessions. Lately, it's harder because they have become more aggressive and more intense, and more things are at stake. But in this case, during one interrogation session, I realized that she had to study in order to interrogate me, because she didn't know who Vladimir Tatlin was, and she needed to find out, so she went to Wikipedia. She recited by heart the bio, and I say, oh, okay, I have something here. So I decided to say the next piece I do is going to be something that they have to study in order to interrogate me. So I read The Origin of Totalitarianism of Hannah Arendt, and this is something about them, so I think even if they read one paragraph, it will be good, you know. And then, of course, by this time, my dialogue / incisiveness was with the government. The person that the thing I wanted to react was not the audience, but the one audience, which is the institution that was repressing. So in this case, they did, because they actually, when I was reading, one thing was important. I could not go out of my house because I was in house arrest. So, but I put a speaker, so the sound was free. And what they did in exchange was to bring the hack jammers to make a lot of noise, you know. So this is the audience that was reacting, no? The Cuban government, and I think it was pretty good. This is the artwork of the Cuban government. That's the reaction. It was very funny because they actually were so silly that they cut actually in front of my house exactly, and then I gave an interview to, I don't know, CNN or somebody, and I say, proving it was for us that they did, and then they came 2 days later and put it a little bigger, so to demonstrate I was wrong, you know, and then they stopped for months, They didn't fix it for many months. One thing that is interesting is, and it's a joke, although things there are very bad, but at this time, a lot of activists and artists were doing actions that created a reaction from the government. Like, for example, there were artists in a very poor neighborhood talking about the lack of water, how they didn't have proper water and so. And then because of this, the government came like a week later and fixed the water. So we had a lot of people on the internet telling us, please come here. So you do a performance, so the government fixed stuff, So yeah, sometimes reaction can be useful. And yeah, that's what I want to say. Yeah, I think the last thing we have done is, and I don't want to show images because they don't belong to me and I don't want to appropriate them, is the fact that the Cuban government now, I also feel that in Cuba being an artist is not interesting anymore, because now it's the people who are actually doing actions that make the government to mobilize and react. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, now we covered quite a wide field of practices and works, so it's not so easy to bring that together. But maybe to start, focusing on the question of the audience also means like whom. And one thing would be then, like you said, Tania, that you have always different audiences that you specifically address in a way. But both of you, I wonder, as whom are you addressing them? So because as an audience member, that's quite important in a way. And from experiences I have, like with your work, I'm sitting across from somebody who is a character, but I'm not a character. So I have either the choice to assume a character, but then you are smart enough to tell everybody that this is not really me, so I have no chance. So there's an, let's say, a hierarchy. With your work, Tania, it's of course very different, but also I would say you're not usually not present. With some works you are, but often you are not. You delegate the work to others. So when it's not always true, but in some works, for example, like famously when you serve cocaine in a panel discussion and these things. So it's also difficult to address somebody as an audience. So whom am I dealing with? And you both do that purposely to create also a certain confusion. But maybe could you talk a little bit both about, and to specify in your case, Tania, when you are there, of course it's not a persona, but you always said now you're performing. You're performing for the interrogators, you're performing for the audience. So there's also a persona, a different kind of Tania involved. So maybe if you first start, both could tell a little bit about what is this persona that you perform, why is there a persona, and what is your relationship to it?
In my case, it's not a persona, it's like the augmentation of an aspect of myself, So I'm not a persona, I'm just highlighting or giving a bigger space to part of me. And that's the one I want them to. And actually, and also the other thing is, I feel like sometimes we see the interaction with the audience as a one thing, like a binary thing. I do something and you react. And I feel that in my case, it has layers. Like I have different layers for different audiences, even in the same room. So it's not like a one generic proposition that have a one generic response. For example, and also sometimes you have to go deeper and deeper, no? For example, in the project I did at the Tate with the Tate neighbors, it was a performance for the institution, not for the people. It was a performance, and the audience was the members of the Tate, the director, the vice director, the people who clean the floor, the people who put the curators, the people who guard. Because the question I was asking the institution is, you are very important internationally, but are you as important for the people who live next door? And what I did is bringing people around who actually, some of them had relationship before with the Tate, I also make a big point of bringing people from Tate, ¿cómo se llama? This one? Oh? The people who were doing the oil thing. Liberate Tate. I made a really, sorry guys. I made a really big effort to bring them, and the institution was very scared. Very scared.
Maybe to just, for the ones who don't know, Liberate Tate was working for many years against the sponsorship of BP, which was the main sponsor of Tate, and with many actions and performances. And actually, I think like 2 years ago, Tate finally dropped BP as a sponsor.
So I think also, for example, it was very important that Liberate Tate was part of that group, because my audience was the institution, not the people who live around, you know. And actually, it was pushing because I had different reactions, and we had to evolve the project in relationship with the reaction. So I think this is another thing. I feel that what I want is not say, hey, people react. It's just like, where do I want to go, and how can we go together, you know? And for example, we were able to put the name of the building we make a democratic situation where everybody selected in the group selected the person. We wanted to put the name of the building, and it was Natalie Bell, who is an actual person who is a social worker in the neighborhood for many years. And this is in front of the Russian billionaire who paid £100 million to put the name on the other building. But then we had that, and the people were very happy, but it was not enough. Because symbolism for me is not enough anymore, even in the reaction of the audience. Because many times we get too comfortable and too satisfied with symbolic reaction from the audience. And then we work with the director of the Tate, who was amazing, Morris, to make Natalie Bell not only a name in a building, but actually part of the board of the Tate. So now they could have a voice inside the board. So this is, for me, working with the audience, which is the institution. And I'm sorry, but in a way, I didn't care about anybody else who went to a show. And I did other things for a show because I need to satisfy other things. But that was my real piece. And actually, at the end, I told the curator of the show, we should eliminate everything else and just leave this. But it was too much, so they wanted people to interact. So, yeah. But this is, yeah. And sometimes you have to decoy, like put like fake stuff, like no? You have to put like some traps. So people, and then they go, yeah. Sorry, I sound like a bad person, but that's how you do art.
But yeah, well, manipulation is maybe something also to talk about. But because with you have this stage persona, so there's a persona. On the other hand, you bring a lot of. I mean, your daughter was on stage often. You bring a lot of personal things in. So there's quite a contradiction between this kind of a role and actually putting everything on stage. It seems.
Sorry, I don't know what I do with my mic. No, I think I actually have never seen anything you've made until just now. And it seems super amazing to me. I think you should be like the president. It's super fascinating. No, but I feel like I use a lot of traps.
I want to be on the other side criticizing. It's funnier. It's more fun.
I understand that. I think, yes, I feel like I understand when you say like decoys. I feel like you and I are obviously doing something very different, but I feel like really my goal is to connect with people on like the most authentic platform that I can possibly get to. And I really, really challenge myself to do that every single show, which I think has actually caused me a lot of health problems. And yeah, I mean, it's like I had my ex partner for a long time was like my sidekick, and he's very diplomatic. He's from Bogota, Colombia, and he's really like the straight man, you know, and a lot of people would defer to him. He was really used as a trap to help you feel comfortable, to open up. He's very warm. He can be very warm. And I have a lot of other people that help me. There's Lonnie, who's Sherry's assistant, and she's very sexy. And so I use her to manipulate people. For instance, she will steal your cell phone and she'll take pictures of her vagina or her breasts, and you have those on your phone, and then we'll like use it later in the show to manipulate you. But it is very much about manipulation, in my opinion, for a good reason. It's like to get you to acknowledge that you're an alcoholic, or that you have a sex addiction, or that you were abused as a child, and you can talk about it in a group of people, and we can push through it. And it sounds like it's like making fun of people, but it really doesn't have that tone. And I think that I am able to read people because I had like 2 parents that were great parents in many ways, but like also not great parents. And I think I had the job of deciphering things like at a very young age, like deciphering difficult things, like drugs were involved, domestic violence was involved. Like I had to really understand, like, who am I working with? Who are these people that are supposed to keep me safe? And so at a very young age, I think I learned very quickly how to read people. And yeah, I hope that answered your question about persona. Yeah.
Actually, I would.
Can I say one thing? I think it's very important. I don't know how you do that, but I think for me it's very important to distinguish when I'm doing a project the people who are my collaborators and the people who have to be, for example, when I work with an institution, I make complete transparent, like I'm completely transparent. They know exactly what I'm going to do. I don't trick them, So same when I'm working with a group of people, they know everything. They have to agree. For example, in Colombia, when I did this panel, they knew exactly that the drug was going to come, and they say yes, because that's the problem,
This I was reading in the conversation between the two of you, and when I read it, I was not sure if you say the truth.
It is the truth. No, I always say the truth. I don't need to. I don't have the advantage of saying no truth because the government is always listening, and they use when I say something is not true, they use it against me. So I have to say the truth. But yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish that even the people who are working with you also react. So also it's for them the performance. So.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that I'm not always honest, unfortunately. I think like I have to really play my cards right for it to really work, and I think that they know that, and they're kind of like, we know that we have no clue what's going to happen in this, 2 hours or 6 hours or however long it is. And I think that, that I did a show called 37 Sherrys where I trained students. I trained, I think, 42 students to become Sherry over a period of 5 weeks. And I guess 6 of them ended up like attacking me in the show and taping me to a table and trying to pour Coke down my throat because we were working with exorcisms. So they wanted to like give me an exorcism. And it was amazing because I was like very triggered because I was like, you guys don't know what you're doing. Like I saw the tape over there, like you know what I mean? Like you didn't do a good job. And also you actually could have killed me because if you poured Coke down my throat, like I could have choked. So it was a nice mix between like I'm offended that you didn't do a better job and I'm hurt that you like turned against me, which is interesting because then I become an audience of my own, yes.
I think it's. No, but I think it's also interesting in connection to what you, Claire, said about the shift to care and healing or repair, as Karatia is calling it, this turn in there. And I was wondering, when listening to you too, where a lot of confrontation is still involved, how this relates, because at the same time there is a relation. You talk about, talk about helping people or having a therapy. You talk about certain safe environments that you need to create for the people working with you. So maybe, I don't know, could you besides the fact that I actually would like to ask you what you have written down doing this, but could you say a little bit more about the relationship or the role of care and healing in this approach to
Well, what I'm writing down are just notes what these two are saying because it's interesting. Is this on? Yeah. This is, my head's absolutely fried around care at the moment because I did a seminar on it with some of the people in this room this afternoon, and they will know that I was unable to come to any kind of conclusion about it, and now I feel even more messed around. But it's something staying in my mind from what one of the students, Susie, said earlier, which was about care and discomfort not necessarily being incompatible affects, and that discomfort can be a path. How did you phrase it, Susie? Discomfort could be a path to care, or that
Comfort can lead to pain.
comfort can lead to, or care can lead to an awareness of discomfort. But I think maybe what we're dealing with here on the other way around is like discomfort as the path to care with the case of therapy. But Tania, I don't know. What's your response?
Yeah, I sorry I'm talking so much, but I haven't talked to people in a long time. But the thing is, I feel, and I will talk about this also in the book, but I feel that there is positive energy. I don't know how to say it better. If you guys have a better way to name it, please let me know. But there is, oh, this is super loud now. So there is like two kind of energy. There is positive energy and negative energy for the work. Positive energy is the work everybody loves because you are saying what they are not able to say because they're afraid, but they're really inside of them wanted people to say it, and they don't have the courage or they don't have the conditions to do it, and they feel reaffirmed through the work, and the reaction you have from that kind of audience is happiness and approval of the work because you have confirmed something that they already thought. Then you have negative energy, which is when you do work about things people don't want to hear about, things that are maybe traumatic, still traumatic for them, or things they haven't figured out yet. So for them, it's a very tough exercise of dealing with actual pain or irresolution, you say in English? Non-resolution? Unresolved issues, you know? And this is the negative energy. And sometimes you can go from one to another. Like the Tate project came from a negative energy and became a positive energy. But we have to walk together for months to change that energy. And I have to say that in my work, when I get positive energy, I'm not that excited. Because it's like propaganda. Nice propaganda, though. But yeah, so I think it's, yeah. So I know when I work with both energies. Things people don't want to hear about, you force them to do it, and things they just like, oh, we just discovered this about ourselves. Oh, great. You know, so that's different. I don't know.
I mean, I have a lot of questions, but since we're already late, I would, and we're talking about participation, so I would ask if you have comments or questions. It would be important that you use the microphone so people in the stream also can hear you. I think first there and then there.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I would really agree with Claire when she says that participation in art before Occupy was really about healing this broken social bond. So in a way, it was already about care in a certain way. But the other side of the coin, I think that meant that it was much about eliminating or diffusing conflict in a way. And this is something that you brilliantly explain when you use antagonism as a category to criticize relational aesthetics, but it's not just that type of antagonism which is internal to the artwork. And this is something very different, for example, if we go back to what was, for example, participation in theater, at least in Europe in 1968, in the 70s. Back then we see practices in which participation was not about diffusing conflict, but was about deepening conflict, was about deepening the social fracture, especially from a class point of view. And one simple thing that I would add to your brilliant reconstruction is that it was not the participation in art happening in a let's say, vacuum of social movements at the turn of the millennium. There was the altermondialist social movements There was also Southern, remember, like Puerto Alegre, the social forum, and that social movement was killed, literally, in Genova, and then after that, by the 11th of September. Still, I think that this neoliberal capture participation as a sort of governmental tool to diffuse conflict happened because it was pre-2008. So there was still an idea that progressive forces could, in a way, use art as a means to sort of address globalization to a progressive, let's say, end, which I think was totally illusory now. And just to arrive at the end of my observation, so now you correctly say that it is all about care, but I think we should really learn from what happened to participation in the art field. So, and we must be aware that if care is not entangled with processes and projects of liberation, be them based on race, of gender, on class, this could be another aesthetic dispositif to diffuse this very project of liberation. So I think we should really learn from this neoliberal governmental idea or practice of participation that relational aesthetics and many dialogical practices embodied. Not all of them, not Tania for sure, because you paid in the first person your artist activism, for example, against the state apparatus in Cuba. But again, this is something that we must, I think, acknowledge. The fact that then when these practices are disembodied or are taken away from these social processes of antagonism, of liberation, they can become an alibi. So I can, you know, I'm a white European male. If my use of care, if my practice of care is simply like a sort of, let's call it, unproblemized aesthetic use of care, you know, this could become an alibi for my privilege, you know, in a way, because I want to take care of myself, because it is about feeling good, because it is about exactly what you said today in your class, which I had the pleasure to participate in. So, I mean, I think I made my points quite clear. Yep, thank you.
No, that's great. I don't have a whole lot to add to it. That's really useful. I've been thinking, you know, when a word circulates to a certain point, you have to start tackling it and bringing some critical analysis to it. And I think we're at that point with care, and I'm yet to read a good critical analysis of care. But that what you're speaking about is exactly, it's been in my mind as I'm writing this, that we run the risk of just being in repetition. We've changed the terms, but not really the structures around this way of working.
I actually feel that post Facebook and all of that, we have I have a different approach. I think we have substituted the idea of care for the idea for the virtue signaling. Virtue signaling. And I think that is actually contaminating art, because a lot of artists are pretending they are caring, and they are actually performing care, but they are not caring. Sorry, but that's what I think.
I was going to ask something to Claire and to Tania, because I think the use of care in some situations, when they appropriate, you know, the language of certain non-white people, it's like a new form of new age, because they're disenfranchised of, I'm sorry to say this, but it's blatantly depoliticized, and it's blatantly useless, you know, in the way that you address art as use, non-useless. How do you say arte útil? Exactly. So that's part of the question, because you posed the question of Guadalupe Maravilla there. So I'm curious about what you think about it.
Oh, the Maravilla, the last image. Okay, so you regard that as fake care?
Yes.
Okay. I'm wary of coming down very hard line, and you know, I feel like I don't. What's the phrase? I don't have any skin in this what was that phrase? You know, I'm not particularly invested in this debate. I would say I'm kind of I was very invested in participation and trying to sort out a position on it. I don't feel like this is my battle to be staging, and so but I don't feel like I'm really in the critical job for naming and blaming. This is authentic care. This is real. This is genuine. This is not, which I did a bit of as a critic in artificial health.
I'm saying that there is a consequence in your body when you're exposed to that kind of experience. What do you do of that? What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know. I haven't experienced that particular work, but I would say it's probably very entangled with being at MoMA in one of those big white endowed galleries, and for sure the work shifts in different contexts. So I don't know. It's hard to comment on pieces that one has not experienced firsthand. And although I've made a whole career out of doing that, I'm feeling a little bit more uncertain about it these days.
Thank you. It was an amazing set of presentations. I'm curious, and I know, Florian, that one of the earlier manifestations of this series addressed institutions, but I'm kind of curious about how you see any possible future for organisations or for the institutions that have traditionally been the gatekeepers or the curators or the re-granting the context in some cases, because notions of care and of participation and of other things have all of the critiques that you make of some of the work and that some of the audience just made can be levelled even more so at many of the organisations in which we've worked or run, and I'm curious as to how you see the future of those in this context.
Alejo, I can't. The future of institutions, I can't do it. I can't do it, and I know that's what you're thinking through at the moment. Like, what kind of institution is needed now at this historical moment? And I don't know. I mean, I've done my work of speculative fiction on MoMA after it reopened 2 years ago, but I don't have anything to say about the future of institutions. I'm going to hand right over to someone else.
So, okay, I think that the problem with care, or not the problem, I see care as trust. And for me, this is the problem with the idea of care in social engaged art. Sometimes it's fake because it can only exist if you trust the person. If there is, not the person, but if you have trust in the environment. And this is why when I see all this, I haven't seen some of this work in person, but I think we have to be honest, because sometimes artists or institutions are presenting work as if they care about certain people, and actually the real spectator, the real person for which the work is done is this white, European, rich, whatever, board member, whatever, so I think this is why I understood what you were saying before to Claire, Gabriela, because I think the shift has been that now, as I see it, a lot of art is not to perform care for people, is not to have reaction to this kind of big audiences, it's about one-on-one, two-on-two, small groups, and people performing their culture without having to translate it to other. Because we also need to understand that the audience has to work. Many times we do art, or the institutions want art, that people react, but the audience has to work. They have to earn the reaction. They have to work to get that. It's not like, so I think this is something that I really like that has shifted. The other thing is that, it's more or less what I want to say. And the other thing is like, I think this is it.
I was just wondering because Tania was addressing institutions as audience directly. You haven't done that, but in a way, you challenged institutions also quite a bit in curators and so on, and there were frictions. So what is your relationship to this question about institutions and where where did it end, this relationship with institution, or does it end with it?
I mean, I think that's why I have to now do shows in my house, because I'm like, have no relationship with any of them. Things are horrible between them and myself. Yeah. I mean, not all of them. I think like some of them maybe understand more, but I think, I don't know. I think I've also not really ever been that interested in institutions, and I've always, I've never like been like fiscally sponsored, like I've made a living off touring, and which is like, kind of like saying, I don't want to depend on you, and I don't want a board of people telling me what to make and what not to make, and I think that's been very important to me. And I think it's given me a lot of freedom. And so I feel like, I don't know, I admire like what you guys are doing and talking about very much, because it feels like you found a way to engage with an institution and sort of use them against themselves. And that's like, to me, fascinating, because I think I'm like not smart enough to do that. So I just like sit in my living room and like tell people to fuck off or something like that. I feel like I'm not nearly as good as you two, but no, I mean, but truthfully, I think I have a lot of like self-doubt, which I think is like where these characters come from. But if like a theater says, do you want to do a show? Of course I'm going to say yes, I want to do a show. So it's complicated because I want to do my shows and make my thing. But I love like all the curators that I've worked with. I think there have been a couple times where an audience has said like, what are you, like, you are like, who would ever pay you to do this? Like, this is, you're terrible. And Sherry has a real trashy sort of aesthetic or like demeanor. You can't tell, like, is it this? It's meant to be like, I'm really Sherry. It's meant to be like, Sherry is real. She is a real person. A lot of people think she's real. And so I remember one time I had the curator come up and like show a contract and show like how much money I was making doing the show. And it was a lot of money at that particular venue. It was like 20,000 euros for like 2 shows or something like that. And the person was just like, what? And I think this really provoked such an interesting conversation. And that is what I'm interested in with institutions. Like, to get to that point, to be like, okay, what are we really talking about? I'm making a lot of money to do this show, so what do you think about that? You know what I mean? That's like, I don't know, it's kind of cutting through it. Well, I don't really always earn money, but I did at this particular moment, and so.
I think one reason why I have nothing to say about institutions is that I felt I went on a sort of an institution strike as a result of museum response during the pandemic, and the disconnect between the performance of diversity and inclusion in the programming and the reality of which workers were laid off so abruptly and so brutally in those first 6 months of 2020 disgusted me to the point where I've only recently started going back to museums and looking at things. And those Instagram accounts, Council Art Galleries and Change the Museum, I think really lay out for you the disconnect between a rhetoric of care and inclusion the disconnect between programming and actual treatment of workers that is really hard to stomach in this country. I don't know if it's as acute in Europe. The tape, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask a similar question, because I thought that it is important to bring it into the room, the question of institutions, because that's kind of the frame, that's the stage in which you are developing the idea of participation, right? Because participation is like all the time, everywhere, but in this particular way, it's the frame of the institutions, and that's how we're seeing it. And I also so basically, since they already asked that, I just kind of wanted to make a few comments, and maybe a question would come out of it. One is that it seems like the Occupy movement and then the age of re-energized movements was an important point for a lot of people in the presentations. And something to point out about the question of institutions is that was it wasn't just a moment of kind of actions and attacks against institutions, it was also a different kind of institution, because there was a lot of resources inside of the movements which were temporarily replacing a lot of the kinds of resources that institutions were offering, like audience and media making and stuff like that. So that's, I think, an important way to think about it. And also maybe a way to think about the question beyond just like, what's the future institution? Because the problem then is you're thinking kind of linearly about like, how does an institution go from point A to point B? However, I mean, it's kind of like with the pandemic, you can see an apartment can be an institution. There's a kind of idea of a private institution or a neighborhood self-organized institution somehow, but we're talking about MoMA. We often end up talking about MoMA and thinking, what's the future of MoMA? And then one last thing I want to say is, and sort of going in the direction of Tania, is, and then this latest round that was in some ways provoked by the Occupy into Black Lives Matter and decolonize and people like that, is this hyper-politicization of institutions, so that it really, so that who the board, and I've been part of that too, from the Occupy museums when I was doing that, who the board members are is like critically important. Everybody knows, and that's the first point. You can see now with the Russia, invasion, the first point is you go directly to the board member. And so then institutions then are not just in the art world, they're part of the state politics, right? Which that I kind of wanted to bring it back. And I guess the closest I could come to forming a question is kind of how do you, not what is the future of institution, but where are you seeing the edges of this understanding of institution as we see the state, power, not just in Cuba, but like everywhere, right? Start to see how it really is functioning politically. And it can be disempowering for artists. It's like empowering, and then it's second later, it's disempowering because it seems kind of emptied out. But just, I don't know, I just want to leave you with those thoughts. And I know Ann Liv also.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, this is just making me think of something. I think it was in like 2004 or 5. I did a show as Sherry at PS1. And there was a girl who went right before me, and she, I think, is like a performance artist, like / painter. And Sherry, like, she was doing like a thing, and Sherry, my motive was that I was going to use the end of what she did as my starting off point. So I like asked her about what she was doing as this character, this Southern whatever character. And I was, sort of like, I don't understand what you're doing. Like, can you explain it to me? And she got very offended and like really offended. And there was like a whole fight between this character I was playing and this artist. And she like tried to physically fight me, and people had to hold her back. And then they like turned the sound and lights out on my performance. And there was like, I think, a bunch of buckets of urine. So like those were getting knocked over onto people because somebody had turned the lights out. And it turns out that like her boyfriend was on the board of PS1, like was giving a lot of money to PS1. And so that's why they like cut out my lights and my sound. And I found this out later just like doing research. And I don't know, that was like one of the first moments where I was like, wow, this is so fascinating that like her shitty little performance that was like, where is Jane? Where is Jane? They're like walking in circles saying, where is Jane into a microphone, supposed to be like some profound experience that I just don't understand. Ended in like all these, hip and wealthy art goers covered in my pee-pee. Like that, for me, that's like how I want to like interact with institutions. Just to. I was just thinking, I love it.
Maybe this is a perfect final word for tonight. I think it's interesting that it turned to institutions tonight. We had an edition already dealing a little bit with it, because of course many people are busy with it, where Nora Sternfeld and others were also thinking about what it would mean to democratize or radical democratize a museum. So I think this can be many more conversations. I thank you very much for being here. It was really great and inspiring. And thank you also for being here.